Hello and welcome to the New York Empire podcast presented by Greatest Ultimate Bag. I'm Hilton. He's Matt, Pippin, Auletta. And a slightly different show today because instead of reviewing the latest week of UFA action involving the Empire, we are actually previewing a huge weekend. And I don't understate that. A huge weekend for the Empire with the Boston Glory up in Boston on Friday. It is Wednesday afternoon as we're recording this. So whenever you're listening to this, Friday night is Boston and then Saturday up in Montreal across the border. So obviously, I think we were going to be starting with the Boston stuff anyway, because we already saw Montreal this season. And when it comes to the top of the East, I feel like Montreal, they might be on their way there, but Boston has fully ascended to that point, losing to DC by a small margin, with DC winning 12-11 against Boston at home, that being DC was at home, with Boston handler Colin Sunday throwing it up late to Babbitt, and it winds up not being completed, and that really could have been the difference there. You know, it's the funny stat from this one, 12 goals is the fewest the DC Breeze have ever had in a game that they won. And, you know, Matt, you've been in so many of these different games with awful conditions, and the disc is slick and wet, and both players from either side kind of complained about that from that game. And when it comes to those low-scoring things at the end of a season, do you chalk up, if you can meet a team again, do you chalk up or throw out some of the ones that are, we'll say, more weather dependent than the other ones and say, all right, maybe that wasn't exactly who we are, who they are? Because 12-11 is just going to wind up at the end of the season saying, oh, remember when DC just barely got the best of Boston at that point?
Yeah, the weather, it's a toss up. I mean, fortunately, I was on the good end of a few of those. The horrible weather in DC in 2018, I think, saved our season, sent us to Toronto. We beat them, went to championship weekend, and the whole destiny of the Empire ever since has kind of been on a much better trajectory. So I also always liked playing in adverse weather. I thought I was maybe just as a handler that was decent at adverse conditions. It never bothered me a ton. Yeah, I mean, what are you going to say? The bad weather affects everybody. Sometimes it just, you have to grind it out. You have to play a little different. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a 1-goal difference. I think it shows that those teams are very close to each other. I mean, DC is obviously very good, and now we are seeing more and more so that Boston is also probably very good. And, if Babbitt had caught that last one, maybe the game goes to overtime. Who knows how that goes? So.
Yeah, and then we move on to Glory against Philadelphia, with the Glory starting pretty slowly against Philadelphia. Philly were up in that game 4-1 in the opening 8 minutes, but then it was 16-5 over the final 3 quarters. You blinked and it was a 19-10 rout. And it says quite a bit, of course, about the Philly offense that is trying to figure itself out at this point. But the Glory, they took care of business. That is enough to be said. And you watched that game, and it really did feel like the Glory, and we'll talk about their lineup now and their team. We're really going to go. That's what this show is. It's an in-depth breakdown, more even of Boston than it is about the Empire. And we're going to preview that matchup. But yeah, as Philly kind of figures it out, Boston just has the tools and the weapons to get the job done.
They're definitely a step ahead of Philly. There's no question there. I was flipping back and forth between the Atlanta-Carolina game and then the Boston-Philly game. The Boston-Philly was close early. Boston was down. I think I flipped back like right around when Boston had maybe taken like a 1-goal lead. I flipped back just a few minutes later, and they were just running away with the game. And like you said, I blinked and I was like, what is happening? I mean, the score and the results are kind of in line with what I expected, but when it didn't start that way, I was like, oh, maybe I'm not right here, or maybe Philly's going to put up a good fight. And it turned out they did not.
No, that Philly has some things to work on this season. But for the Glory, obviously they're a franchise that hasn't been around too long. In the post-pandemic era, they joined the UFA, and they've never previously beaten the Empire, which obviously is no surprise because the Empire hadn't lost in the entire history of the Boston Glory at that point. So obviously that could all change this weekend, where looking at the O-line that Boston will play, with a few pieces out, including Dylan Cook is not going to be available, Cole Davis-Brand not going to be available, that leaves 7 players that have been basically playing the O-line this year. On Sunday, Nathaniel Dick, who's a captain and take on a much larger role this year. Ben Sadok, Tanner Johnson-Go is ready for this one. Kalen McSweeney is back, the UMass product. And then Jeff Babbitt and Simon Carapella. Babbitt, by the way, played just 9 D points this season of his 67 points. So, yes, he's going to be playing O-line against the Empire unless there is something really funky happening. But I also expect Tyler Chan as the 8th to go back to – I expect him to go back to D-line, but he also has been very much like the Empire have considered using Randolph in offensive points when it's we'll call it, crunch time or early to crunch time in that third quarter. So I expect Tyler Chan to play some O-line, but largely play D-line. Then Turner Allen is the other one when players are out or rotated or somebody on that O-line has gone down when McSweeney and Davis Brand were out. So Turner Allen also jumps over. And then the Boston defense is a fun mix of veterans and rookies. Brandon McCann, who's back, thankfully, from that leg injury. So awesome to see him doing his thing again. Gustav Haflin, he's just a big body. He's been there for a while here. Gabe Colton, Ben Katz. I'm trying to think if I know that. Yeah, okay.
Sounds
Ben Katz,
familiar.
you know that name? Yeah. Rocco Linehan is out this week, but Chris Bartoli has only played one game, has returned. And then you add to that either the continuing to emerge players like Peter Borth or rookies. Jonas Stang Osborne, the UMass guy, has had a ton of time, and a guy who can either huck it deep or has been mixing it up in that middle hybrid space. And then Reed Browning and Luke Webb, two other just athletes. That's what rookies are supposed to be. The Empire have Sam Jonas and Reed Browning and Luke Webb for the glory. And so those three, of which, by the way, Stang, Osborne, Browning, and Webb are 3rd, 4th, and 5th in D points played this season. So the rookies are getting burned. They're not just, faces in a crowd. They're getting some bird. And then Orion Cable, I know that's the name people ask about. He's played 8 D points. He did that against Toronto in that blowout win, scoring 5 goals. All of those obviously being breaks, which is pretty nuts plus minus for your season. But he is unavailable against the Empire, so Orion Cable will not be around. We'll talk about him another day. We'll also talk about the yikesies that is Toronto Rush right now, but we'll talk about them again another day, Matt. But for now, yeah, all the players I mentioned are pretty much the 20. I think I only missed 2 or 3 from who's in their 20, but Boston seems deeper than obviously they've ever been, but it seems now more than other seasons they have established roles. That is what this guy does. This guy does that. This guy does that. And I think to have a team and players who know who they are and what they're supposed to do has really built more continuity than I think we've ever had with them before.
Consistency is key for any team. I think in previous seasons with the other top teams in the division or around the league, but week to week they were a little inconsistent with who was available, who was hurt, and it hampered them. Many times where you'd think they might be a playoff team, even if they're not going to go to championship weekend or anything, and next thing you know they're not even really in playoff contention just because week to week the consistency and great players, they still need consistency. That's kind of what we saw with the Empire last week. The O-line has changed, the faces in different roles have changed. And, if you just put that Empire lineup from last week against Atlanta on paper, that still looks like a very, very good team. It is. It's all good players. It's great players, but they didn't have all the reps together, and the consistency is part of what cost them that game. So, with Boston showing more consistency and having a pretty deep and talented roster, also they have a few players that play really big, which is key, especially for this coming game. Empire is without some big players from last season, Babbitt, Lithio. I think it's going to be a very close game. Do you think bigger impact on the game, Ben Katz kind of wrecking havoc just by poaching and making a mess against people he's used to playing against, especially an Empire O-line that might be missing some pieces still or not really settled in, or Jeff on offense, who covers him, and how does that go?
I'm going to throw a third name at you. I like your question, and I will answer it, but I'm going to stall a little bit for a second because
right.
I think Gustav Haflin has the potential to have a really, really big, important day. Because the one thing I'll mention about the Glory and the Empire matchups that I've seen so far through the years is that Haflin, because he's either had to guard Babbitt in the past or then he had to guard Yacht in the first season when Yacht was still playing O-line, he hasn't really had the ability to kind of make those, not say game-breaking plays, but he's been in the mix, and he's kind of had to do his thing in isolation. But the D-line has gotten so much better. Now, this weekend, you're adding Bartoli, and I think the effect of Ben Katz is not seen, obviously, as Ben Katz getting a D or poaching or something. It's that now you have, instead of Gustav Haflin trailing the play and the umpire receiver being thrown open. Now you're going to be seeing, I think, more of a bang play where Halfland has they are, as we mentioned last week in the loss of Atlanta. I think they're going to be more 50-50 plays where I think that Halfland's going to have a better shot instead of, again, a wide open throwing lane, because that's what Ben Katz does. He forces the throw to be he gives the defense just a little bit better of a chance by either making you wait that extra 1 or 2 stall, or forcing the throw from a different angle, or just a slighter worse angle for the offensive player to be able to get it cleanly and the defensive player to have a play on it. So when I think of Katz, to answer your question, that's kind of what I think of his impact affecting the entire D-line and giving Bartoli and Halfland, as you mentioned, those big bodies, better opportunities. As far as what the Empire are going to do with Jeff Babbitt, I could say there are years past when I had some inside information, and this time around I have nothing of any hidden information. I have no idea, and I think for Jeff, it's going to be an assortment of different guys. I think for a time it might be Antoine. I think for a time I would likely see Jeff Holm. I would expect. I mean, when you look at the Empire, also only have 17 players on their active roster as of today, this afternoon, while we're recording. So I'm not entirely sure if they're even going to fill out the 20. And of the 17, I mean, obviously there are defensive players that you can't have on him. You can't have Shankalati on him. You can't have Axel Agami on him. That's just size-wise. Now, it wouldn't be crazy to me to have, now, as you mentioned, with 17, there's not really an O1 or, a D1 or a D2 with 17 guys. Like, you're kind of, to your point, the Empire, if they're only running 17, they're forced to kind of play who they got on D points, and that's it. So I could see, Matt LaBar's come back. He's the one name. He's returned from JMU, being a Callahan candidate there. And then Sam Jonas, as I heard from Babbitt himself, Sam Jonas, when they played basketball together, nobody can guard Jeff in any sport, of course, but Sam Jonas gave him a little bit of work when they were on the same team and they were going through the warm-ups and stuff. So I could see a lot of different bodies on Jeff. But yeah, there is, in the entire league though, there's no like for like. But I think it'll be a combination of different bodies. They might even do it might even be a Ryan Drost on Babbitt, and just kind of, hey, let's try to win every other matchup. And Ryan, if you could beat him on those unders, that would be terrific. But if not, we're going to kind of live with letting Babbitt eat. And as long as we keep Johnson Go in check, as long as we keep Nathaniel Dick in check, as long as we force Kalen McSweeney and Sunday and Sadok to throw it, especially the weather's not supposed to be great. That's what I was going to mention. So if you can force Sadok and Sunday and McSweeney to make a million throws with the likes of Marquez, guarding them and seeing if you can muddy anything up in the handler space with Ethan, I think that would be the option. And it's like, okay, if we get beat with those deep stuff, or if Babbitt eats, we got to stop. Like Sarah Carapella, I don't know who's going to guard him, but my guess would be Breton. And if it's Breton against Carapella and Breton wins that matchup, then that definitely gives the Empire defense a chance to compete.
Yeah. I'm also curious to see if they maybe try something a little different, like Josue on Jeff for a little bit. A few years ago, I know the team would put Josue on Rowan McDonald, and at face value, that always seemed like a slightly strange matchup just based on how Rowan played and whatever. But Josue did such an amazing job limiting all the touches in the middle of the field. And like you said, if you can limit Babbitt's effectiveness as the reset valve or the free open easy cuts, and you just assume that there will be help over the top when you need it by 1 or 2 players, then yeah, maybe they can limit him that way as well.
Yeah, to start this year, Carapella has been awesome. He has been in that middle space of the field everywhere. I think he's still finishing and closing in the end zone the way he did last season too. Carapella, to me, has been terrific. And as I said, I think he really is there. And I think he's the guy that really could set this whole thing up.
Hey, Ryan. Have you ever thought to yourself how you could fit everything you need for one weekend into a single bag?
And there's an incredible layout block.
Oh, there's a Callahan. Mike Drost did it for New York.
From cleats to jerseys to discs, pennies, water bottles, the greatest bag can help.
And this is going to be a greatest here.
This is going to be a Callahan for Ryan Drost.
Thanks to Greatest Bag for being a sponsor of the New York Empire.
And as much as I praise Carapella and what he's doing, and we talked about Boston, we still have to talk about the Empire coming off their first loss in 32 games. So I think the big question is, how are the Empire? There's no John Randolph this week. There's no Elliot Chartok. We're not sure about the status of Mike Dross. We're not sure about the status of Sean Keegan. And we're not sure of the status of Connor Russell. So there's a number of different players that have been in the 20 already that potentially won't be. That's why I said 17 players on the active at this point in the week. So things could very much change. But even with the 17 that are there, those are 17 good players. And the Empire, they obviously have to change something up a little bit. They're a league low 35% on their hucks. It cannot be worse. They are league low. Being 1-1, a lot of their other stats, though, and I say this around the league too with stats, still, they played 2 games. Some teams have played 1, some have played 4. So it's really hard to look at stats and the per game stuff, and that's kind of muddied. But we know that the stats on the 2 games are not great. The Hucks turnovers per game, Empire at 7.5 Huck turnovers per game in 2 games, just behind the Royale at 7.67, which is the worst in the league. So second worst in the league. Something clearly for the Empire has got to be changed up. Defensively is kind of what we were talking about in dealing with Boston's O. But to me, this game truly comes down to the Empire O-line. What can they do against that Boston Glory defense? Is a Glory defense ready to step up to the challenge that has always been the Empire O-line? Because we haven't really seen, as we talked about in the loss against Atlanta, marquee, I'm the guy, Jack Williams, Superman cape, and Yacht has not been perfect downfield, especially to start this year. The continuity has not been great. Liam's Hucks have not been what they were advertised to be coming from Atlanta. So to me, those are the first 3 names that I say. If those guys if they put their Justice League or Avengers, whoever you care about, if they put their superhero capes and masks and gloves or whatever you call them on and are ready to go, they're still stars in this league. And they give the Empire a fighting chance at the top more than, we'll say the other 14 guys, whatever, on this roster.
Yeah, but again, you're not going to win the game just with 3 guys, even if they play really well. I know. But Boston is probably now good enough where you are really going to need a good offensive performance and just solid play from 7, 8, 9 guys. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, with no Elliott and no JR coming over, that's obviously not great. If Keegan doesn't dress either, I mean, that all of a sudden Jack is probably handling permanently. I don't know, maybe Chartok brothers, but Elliott's not in. So I don't even know really how you approach the game in that situation. I mean, I'm sure they've been practicing with people who will be available, but again, I mean, it's just not the consistency you're looking for. And, if Haberfield's chucking it to Yacht, maybe they get a few more reps together, maybe it'll get a little better, but it wasn't a good look last week against pretty good defense. So if Boston can kind of replicate some pressure, and if the conditions aren't great, I mean, I could see this not going the Empire's way again.
Yeah, I think this will say a lot about the Empire, their championship medal, their championship mentality, and with the weather too, it does come down. I know it sounds so silly and intangible, but sometimes I wind up over analyzing the names and the numbers and all that stuff. And some games are just about, I guess this is the thing before we transition to Montreal, but this game matters. I mean, this game matters not only for the record and standings and, Anthony Nunez and Cat Stevens and the family and, the Empire family, like everybody can say that it's not about, it doesn't matter who's on the other team. Like, it doesn't matter who's wearing number 87 for Boston. It doesn't matter who's wearing 28 for Boston, but it does. I mean, those are Empire players for a long time. You know each other, you practice against each other, you travel together. And this one, I think, matters. I mean, you want to beat, again, you love each other, but you want to beat each other. And this one is personal in all, I hope, the best ways for Ultimate. Now, something that was personal, I feel like Montreal handily beating the Rush 15-12 was a bit personal because Montreal had not won again in over a year. So getting one over the Rush probably felt pretty good. And Brissett was back and doing his thing, almost 400 total yards of offense. So he did have 4 turnovers and finished with a -1 plus-minus, which is just, that's an awesome day. That just means to me, that's a guy who's having fun. That's how I approach leagues, I think, spring league and winter league. Give me a lot of total yards of offense, but turnovers. Let's forget about it. It doesn't matter. And then DeCrone has 22 scores in 3 games. Absurd. 7 goals, 15 assists, 8 blocks, a plus 20. The runaway rookie of the year. More than 8 more than any of his teammates, by the way. A plus 20, I mean. The closest is a plus 12. And he, with his insane usage, he also only has 10 turnovers on the season. So he'll likely already cross 2,000 total yards this season against the Empire this weekend, which is insane. Against the rush, William St. Pierre, who's still figuring out his new role as a hybrid in the middle, but he was better and more involved against Toronto for sure of what I saw in that game. And it was definitely a good game as well against the rush, no offense to them, to sort things out for St. Pierre, who again has been kind of slow to adapt to his new role. And then Laborde had 6 goals against Toronto, really working well, cutting off of Bonneau, where Bonneau attracts so much gravity, and then Laborde just kind of finishing it up. And then Montreal, as we saw, they're a lot deeper, and their D-line is about league average or slightly below right now in break percentage, but that's all Montreal needs their D-line to be. They just need them to be average, and they're going to be able to compete in games because their O-line is so much improved. And as I spoke with Alex Lemieux before the Empire game, he wanted the red zone offense to get better than the 50% it was last year, and they're at 76% right now, which puts them within percentage points of the Breeze and the Glory in red zone offense. So that's pretty good. The Empire through 2 games, again, kind of throw some of these stats out the window. They're a healthy 86%. And then Carolina, 97% red zone offense for Carolina. Jeez Louise. Yeah, I think we, at this point, other than Salt Lake, I think we've got 2 title favorites at the moment, and that are in the East, which is quite the surprise because obviously the East have been the team, DC and New York, that we felt like was going to be the champion the last few seasons. So, and then just like with Boston, it's usually not great weather in Montreal, but the weather report doesn't look great either. And so when you have Montreal not great weather and windy conditions when the sun is shining, then you add a little bit of rain to that, Matt. You've been there before. Who knows what's going to happen? So, I mean, as much as we're focusing on Boston, Montreal looks better than they did when the Empire met them in game 1, and they seem to have figured some more things out, and they're at home with that good crowd, and the weather is going to be looking like it's going to be absolute nonsense.
Montreal was always a very sneaky, hard place to play. They've always had great fan turnout, and it's always been a really fun place to play. But, both locations I've played in, there's been swirly winds, and, if the weather report is not great and Empire's playing, second game, and they might be lacking some offensive players, and the consistency is all over, and maybe they are coming off either a close game the night before. I mean, I could again just see Montreal like running and gunning, having fun out there, running really hard in adverse conditions. Like it's wild to me to say that this almost feels like a toss-up as well. Like I think Empire is the better team, but by how much and under what circumstances?
Yeah. So this, as I mentioned, this is a huge weekend. I bookended by saying that. Actually, I'm going to jump it on you. I'm not saying it's a running joke, but we didn't mention the name Charles Weinberg. So as you've been saying throughout the weeks, we're going to try to throw his name in every week. And Charles Weinberg, when you talk about grinding, you talk about who cares what the conditions are, you talk about the other guys doing the stuff. If Charles Weinberg and Oliver Chartok have huge weekends, then the Empire have likely come out of this with 2 Ws. Because if those two don't really have the production that are needed with everybody else, then yeah, it'll be a rough weekend. But so Charles Weinberg, we're always going to mention that name because you can't let those guys be forgotten in the mix. And I think to your point as well, 17 players. Now we could see, the 20 be filled out. There are players who are dressed, including Sean Keegan. We'll see if he's updated to active. Mike Dross, Matthias Ling are questionable. So let's see if they're updated to active and they hit 20. But if it's just a 17 I see, that's a gosh darn good 17 that the New York Empire are rolling out against Boston and Montreal. But you're right. With just 17 players for 2 straight days, Friday night against Boston and then Saturday against Montreal, this is a huge test, and it's going to say a lot about who the Empire are. At this point in the season, they're still trying to build stuff. But yeah, to have these wins are going to be really important because with Montreal getting better, playoff spots are not guaranteed anymore with Boston and DC, and you also want to host. So hosting is going to be tougher for the Empire this season. DC dropped their first game of the season against Carolina, which now, look healthier and healthier the better Carolina are, because Carolina are just utterly dominant. Then Boston, again, giving everybody a tough test and losing just by 1 to DC. So I don't know. It's more fun. I said it.
Yeah.
I said to somebody, Matt, that these podcasts are more fun when we really, really, really get to break stuff down, as opposed to previous 2 seasons where we were just saying, yeah, I mean the Empire, they are their business. But these are more fun. But it also means that you and I are going a little grayer, and I'll be gray by the end of the season.
Do you think Babbitt comes down with any buzzer beaters? That was another question I had. You think he racks one up this weekend?
Well, judging on actually how they're using him in those situations, I think he might only be out there in 1 or 2 situations. So I think if the wind and rain are as awful as they are, you kind of don't want to throw him in those situations. It'll depend how close but the game is going to be close, I would assume. So I'm going to say 1. Like, yeah, of course, it's Jeff Babbitt. So I'm going to say one big one he comes down with, of course. And I'm not even going to look at the 17 for the Empire because I don't want to put any of them on the receiving end of it. But yeah,
I think he'll have a stamp on at least 2 of the quarters, whether they're goals or blocks. I forget where I saw it. Yacht did like a interview with somebody, and they were talking about like how often do you and Jeff go up for 50-50s, or like how often do you win? And Yacht was just very, very blunt, and he's like, I just almost never win them. So, I would love to get I would love to get to see it in a game that matters when they're not on the same team. So,
Yeah. Well, that was a Colorado crew with Alex Atkins and and the Colorado coach.
Maybe
maybe
Yacht will get him, and he could get him a little too small. It'd be nice to see a little friendly banter.
Knowing those guys personally, know that again, they love each other, but they're going to be talking from the minute they get out of the cars, off the bus, whatever. I mean, there is chatter going on, and yeah, it's all going to be love and hugs before and after, but during, they're going to be. And if you don't think Antoine Davis is already sending texts or and again, that is the fun part of this. They know each other again, they love each other, but yes, and to Yacht's credit, and I think the rest of the Empire too, the way they talk about Jeff is with a great reverence. Like, again, he's just a fantastic player. He's MVP of the league for a reason last year, and he is somebody to fear. But fear and respect mean that you also, if anything, the Empire know his weaknesses more than anybody else. And it feels like he doesn't have any, but if anybody can figure out how to make sure he doesn't get that front going, it's the D-line that went against him day after day and practice after practice for 7 years. Not everybody, but you know what I mean? Like, I feel like if one team can figure it out, it might be that Empire D-line that went against him. So yes, the Empire, they've got a big test on their hands, aside from just number 87 this weekend. So Friday, May 17th against the Boston Glory up in New England, then the Montreal Royale the next day over the border. And then it's back to Joseph F. Cena Field the next Friday, May 24th at 7 p.m. So get your tickets early, and we will see you soon.